Hello and welcome back to the scientific ethics lecture where we're going to continue our look at DNA and genetic analysis with the question of a genetic census. And so again, what we've covered so far within this section of the course is the idea we can study the DNA molecule. We can chop it up into big fragments, do those restriction fragment length polymorphism, fancy name for saying we're going to chop up our DNA molecule, chop up our chromosomes, and look at a distinct pattern. And from that pattern, we can use it to determine paternity of an individual. We can use it in forensic science to, ascertain the likely involvement of an individual in a crime or their innocence, or potentially we could use this to find kind of the interrelatedness of individuals in the 23andMe or the ancestry kind of genetic analysis. In the last lecture, we talked a little bit more about very specifically going through and sequencing the DNA, looking at the exact information that's found within the DNA molecule to understand whether or not it's a normal functioning gene, or if it potentially has some altered information, and that altered information can change the individual and change the individual's characteristics. It may result in the development of disease or make it an individual predisposed to getting an illness later on within their life. Now, what we've got is taking a look at a genetic census. And so what a census is an official count or survey of a population, recording details of the individuals. And so 2020 was a census year. So most individuals had to report where they were on April 1st, where they lived, and that information then is going to be used by the government to determine the population size, do representation, in a variety of ways, a number of representatives in Congress for a region, redistricting, how many hospitals a area should have, how many federal funds they should have, things like that. And so what happens then is that the census goes through, counts the number of people living in the area, and tries to understand, a little bit more about the family dynamics. And so it collects information about the number of people in a family, their relationships, their age, their race, and their sex. But more recently, they've added additional information to the census as well. And again, this is information that's used in genealogical studies, trying to trace your ancestry generations from now, because it's going to be information that's sequestered from the public for I think 70 or 80 years, maybe a little bit longer. I'm not exactly sure which. Hopefully on another slide I've got that. But now it has information about employment status, annual income, whether an individual is a homeowner or renter, and other questions kind of related to it as well. The questions, a lot of the questions are the same in every census, so we can see longitudinal how things change over a period of time. But there's also a tendency to add in some new questions for questions that are facing ideas or concepts is facing society at this period in time when the census is being taken. Now, the U.S. Constitution mandates that the country conduct a count of its population once every 10 years. So they need to do this census every 10 years. Like I said, 2020 was an example of a census year. And so the idea of this is that representatives' indirect taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers. And so the number of representatives in the House of Representatives is determined by population. Federal funds coming to local regions is going to be determined by the population. And then this kind of gets into that controversial area that the Constitution was set up 200 plus years ago. It shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for terms of years, as the indentured servitude. We used an example of that in an earlier question, and excluding Indians not taxed, again, issues associated with that, and 3/5 of all other persons. This kind of represents the slavery issue as well, very prominently within the Constitution and as it relates to the census. And so this, again, set up 200 plus years ago, and we're still trying to deal with the implications of what all this means and trying to correct what was going on at that period of time with our kind of better understanding of how we should be acting and interacting with one another. Now, the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of Congress. It's been longer than that. Within every subsequent term of 10 years in such manner as they shall by law direct. And so Congress can determine the questions that are going to be determined by the census. The results of the census and decennial, again, nice scientific word, or at least fancy word that says every 10 years. It determines the number of seats each state will have in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's used to draw congressional and state legislative districts, and it's used to apportion federal funds in a variety of uses, including hospitals, schools, and roads. So basically, the money that's going to be going from the federal government back to the local population. Now, what we can see, and this is an example of the population change between 2000 and 2010. So we can take a look at the country population as it changes over a period of time. And so kind of the light bluish region here, we can see kind of Florida, some areas in Texas, Alaska. These are areas that grew 20% or greater during that 10 period of time. The kind of dark gray grew 10 to 19.9%. And so those areas, kind of the blues, the grays, and the lighter blues are areas that are growing in population. The areas that are in green and darker green, dark green is a small gain. So the light green areas are loss, and it doesn't say how much of a loss. I misread the legend of the chart for a second. I thought the blues were gains and the greens were loss. But you can see is that many of the rural areas of the country are seeing a decline in population towards more urban areas and more towards the southern and coastal regions of the United States, with the exception of some of the kind of mountain states kind of out through here. So again, that shows us the changes in the population over a period of time. And that's based on the census. Pennsylvania currently, and again, this is 2018, has 18 congressional districts, and we can see kind of the distribution of this. Each one of these congressional districts is going to represent a population of individuals living within Pennsylvania. And so you can see, Philadelphia over here, kind of greater Philadelphia region, kind of Bucks County, Montgomery County, all of that. So what we can see over here is that these areas around Philadelphia, the congressional districts are relatively small. If we go out here in the western part of Pennsylvania, they're representing this relatively large mass of land. But the way it works out is this relatively large mass of land is represented by a single congressperson at the U.S. House of Representatives, and this population over here is going to be represented by a single congressperson. But the difference, though, is a much higher population density over here. So a small area is going to have the same population size as this large area over here. So it's a proportion. These congressional districts are based on the population size within the area. And so within a state, they're going to be balanced out so that each representative represents the same general population size of individuals. Now, a detailed personal census records, so that's the information not just on the number of individuals that are living within the area, but who's living at a specific site, who they're living with, their relationship, those other questions, how much they made, their jobs, things like that, are kept private for 72 years. And again, that's, since your private information isn't released out to the general public, even though if you, get on the internet, you can find lots and lots of information is out there about you. But that is a completely different scientific dilemma, ethical dilemma associated with technology. So the census records are only available to the individual named in the record or their legal heir for 72 years. And so potentially you could find out about your individual congressional record and census record by petitioning to get that information. But after 72 years, the census records are treated as a historical record. And that's what I meant by saying that it's used for genealogy. And so you can go to a library, many online databases now, but you would go to a library and read the census report from 100 or 200 years ago and learn about your ancestors in the field of genealogy. And so what we're going to see, very excitingly, if you're interested in these types of things, the 1950 census records are scheduled to be released on April 1st, 2022. So again, 72 years after they were created. Now, having talked about this in terms of a population census, like we do within the United States, bring it back to what we're talking about. Bring it back to the genetics, the DNA, the information that's available there. So we've got these direct-to-consumer genetic sequencing kits. And so we've got an example of one over here. This looks like an ancestry kit here. So, you know, you may get this for Christmas, you may be excited and buy it on sale. You kind of open it up and what you can see, kind of a set of instructions, a mailer so that you can send it back so it can be analyzed. You've got your test tube over here and this like a Ziploc bag that you put it in, and it protects your sample when it's going to be mailed back. But you basically spit into the test tube here, you put it in the mailer, put it in the thing, put it in the mailer, send it back. And then they're going to give you information about your DNA, about the genes that are present for you. But the question is, how many people have actually read the terms and conditions? You know, it's like when you download a new app on your phone. Oftentimes it has, you know, all of these conditions you have to read, you have to agree to be able to use that program. How many of you have actually read that? How many of you know, if you're going to be doing one of these genetic tests, what they're going to be using that information for? Because if you read in that fine print, many of these examples are going to use the fact that you've agreed to send your DNA in for analysis. You've agreed in many cases to opt into their database and opt into doing research on your DNA and information. And at a certain point, that makes sense, because what you're doing is you're putting your DNA sample in and you're going to compare it to the other DNA samples that are in their set. And so that's what you want. You want to find out about, you know, who are the long lost relatives that, you know, that branch of the family that moved, you know, 70 years ago. You can start to discover your cousins and things like that. But they're going to be, hold on, start getting the lawnmower next door. Okay, hopefully a little bit quieter now. So what you're doing when you're sending in your genetic sample, your DNA sample, your saliva in this case, is they're going to be doing genetic analysis to look for similarities between individuals, and they're going to use that information to determine similar ancestry. And they're going to do this worldwide to try to get an idea about heritage, where people, where their families, where their ancestors moved from. So one example of this is a Nature article relatively recently. So this is the distribution of ancestral birth locations. So basically where your ancestors came from in North America, associated with identity by descent clusters. And so identity by descent, don't worry about that. But basically what that means is if you go through here, what you can see is kind of this bluish region are all kind of representatives that had lived in Pennsylvania. The greenish region kind of up here at the top, these are people of Finnish ancestry, 0 to 9 generations ago. Over here in this area, we've got Scandinavian ancestry, 2 to 9 generations ago. These individuals here in Utah came from the Northeast. So we can see that these individuals here are going to have a lot of the genetic similarities to individuals over here. We take a look at kind of Louisiana in this region here. We can see Acadians here, which corresponds to this area up here in Nova Scotia. And so lots and lots of different ways in which we can go through and maybe understand where our ancestors are coming from and where, you know, they moved, where they immigrated to at some point in, you know, the history of the United States, history of North America, but the history of your family. You know, where is it your ancestors came from? And again, this is information that you're opting into if you do some of these DNA tests. If you don't read all of that fine print, if you, say, use my information in, research studies, this is the type of thing that can be occurred. It's not personally identifiable, but it tells a lot about, your family history at a certain level. Another example of this is a little bit greater detail, looking at the Cajuns, Acadians in the Atlantic blue. So we see the blue of Nova Scotia and Louisiana. We can also take a look at the migration of French Canadians. So they've got ancestry 6 to 9 generations ago. They would have characteristics that are found primarily within France. If you go 3 to 5 generations ago, you're going to see that they're, pretty much in the area of Quebec over here, so probably 1785 to about 1876. And then more recently, they've expanded in from that French-Canadian region into the New England region as well. And so again, you can see that shift of individuals from France into Quebec, fewer individuals in France at that time, more individuals within Quebec, and then more recently, fewer individuals in France of that ancestry. It's either died out or they've all immigrated to the areas of basically Quebec and the New England region. What we do with this information, is up for debate. The science is there. The science allows us to analyze this information and learn about it. But the question is, what do we do with this information? How do we use this information that's beneficial? And are there limits to what this information should be used for? So again, technology is allowing us to learn lots of things, but ethics and society needs to think about what are those implications and how should this information be used. Now, the readings for this, articles associated with that mapping from the American Genome study, taking a look at 770,000 people based on ancestral origins, so the immigration patterns, the clustering. This is a Nature article, so it's a little bit more complicated. Start out with the Daily Mail article. That's a Common Press article. Take a look at this. It's got some nice diagrams. If you don't understand the science, don't get bogged down into it. Just kind of scan it, get an idea for what's going on. Don't get bogged down in the details. And then finally, another example of a DNA test and fate, reunited siblings separated decades ago. So the fact that you can use this information, these genetic tests, direct-to-consumer genetic tests, to discover branches of your family that you may not know about or that have been lost over a period of time. So take a look at that. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you and have a great day.